Windsor Castle is the largest and oldest continuously occupied castle in the world. Over 950 years, 40 monarchs, 13 acres of stone and ceremony. Most people see a monument to tradition. But behind those walls, a king was strapped to a chair he called his throne and left to scream for a decade. A dynasty erased its own name overnight. A former king broadcast his exile from the very room that bore his title. And a fire that burned for 15 hours forced a queen to open her doors and her accounts to a public that had stopped believing. Windsor Castle is not a monument to power. It is a machine for surviving the moments when power fails. Chapter 1. The Conqueror's Bluff Above the River. In 1070, the William the Conqueror looked at a chalk cliff above the Thames and saw something more valuable than a fortress, a stage. He had won England at Hastings 4 years earlier. But winning a battle and holding a kingdom are different problems. The Anglo-Saxon nobility still controlled the countryside. The town still spoke a language William barely understood. He needed more than soldiers. He needed architecture. His plan was a ring of castles around London. Each one sat a day's march from the next. If trouble broke out in any direction, an armed column could ride from the capital at dawn and reach a fortified stronghold by nightfall. Windsor occupied the western position, roughly 20 miles from the capital. To the north stood Berkhamsted. To the east, the Tower of London itself. The geometry was precise. The message was blunt. Wherever you stand in this kingdom, a Norman castle is watching. William understood something about conquered people. They do not rebel because they are brave. They rebel because they believe they can win. A castle visible on every horizon is a daily reminder that they cannot. It is cheaper than a garrison, more permanent than a patrol, and unlike a soldier, a castle never sleeps. But Windsor was special. The site William chose was not simply defensible, it was theatrical. The chalk cliff rose sharply from the south bank of the Thames, commanding a view across miles of flat river valley. A wooden keep placed on top of that cliff would be visible from every direction. It would loom over the river crossing, over the old Saxon road, over the surrounding forest. It would be the first thing a traveler saw when approaching London from the west. And that visibility was the point. William's builders dug a ditch around the hilltop, piling the excavated chalk and earth into a mound 50 feet high. This was the motte, a steep, artificial hill with sides too sharp to climb in armor. On top of it, they raised a wooden tower. Below, in a walled enclosure called the Bailey, they built barracks, stables, a kitchen, and a hall. The whole thing went up in weeks, wood and earth, fast and brutal, functional and temporary. The speed was deliberate. William built over 30 castles in the first decade after the conquest, not because he loved architecture, but because he loved control. Each castle was a nail driven into the body of Anglo-Saxon England. Windsor was the nail driven deepest. The location gave William something else: access. The Thames was the main highway of medieval England. Whatever moved between London and the western counties passed beneath Windsor's gaze. Trade, troops, messages. The castle did not merely dominate the landscape. It monitored the kingdom's circulation. It sat on England's wrist and felt the pulse. Except it was not temporary. That is the trick William played on history. Every other motte and Bailey castle from this period has vanished. The wood rotted, the earthworks eroded, the ditches filled with mud and memory. But Windsor endured because each generation that inherited it saw the same thing William saw: not a building, a performance. The chalk mound is still there. Almost 1,000 years later, it sits at the center of the castle complex, now encased in stone. It's now crowned by the round tower that has become the most recognized silhouette in English architecture. But strip away the stonework, strip away the crenellations, strip away the flag that flies when the sovereign is in residence, and what remains is a pile of rubble that a warlord heaped up to make himself look taller. That is Windsor Castle's first secret. Its foundation is not stone, it is stagecraft. And every monarch who came after William understood the same principle. The building does not need to be real. It needs to look permanent. It needs to look as though it has always been there and always will be. The castle's life begins with a bluff, a pile of chalk pretending to be a mountain, a wooden tower pretending to be a fortress, a foreign king pretending to belong. But bluffs only work if no one looks too closely. And within a century, someone would decide that wood was no longer enough to keep the audience convinced. The walls would need to be thicker. The secrets would need to go deeper. And the castle would begin learning the craft that would sustain it for 900 years. It would learn to hide things. Chapter 2. Stone walls learn to keep secrets. Henry III made Windsor's walls 7 meters thick, not to keep enemies out, but to make sure no one inside could be heard. That is an exaggeration, of course. Henry was a medieval king. He thought in terms of siege warfare, not soundproofing. But the effect was the same. When the wooden palisades of William's original fortification were replaced with stone under Henry II in the 1160s, and then massively expanded under Henry III from 1216 onward, Windsor became something new. It became a building that could contain things. Henry II began the transformation. He replaced the timber walls of the upper ward with stone curtain walls and built the first stone keep on top of William's chalk mound. The work took decades. It was expensive, but it turned Windsor from a temporary camp into a permanent statement. Stone does not rot. Stone does not burn easily. Stone says, "We intend to stay." The castle proved the point almost immediately. In 1216, during the civil war between King John and his rebellious barons, a force of rebel soldiers besieged Windsor for 2 months. They battered the walls, dug trenches, and tried to starve the garrison into submission. The stone held. The garrison held. The siege failed. And Windsor's first real test as a stone fortress ended with the attackers withdrawing and the castle standing exactly where it had stood before, scarred but unbroken. The building had learned its first lesson about survival. Absorb the blow, wait, endure. Henry III went further. He rebuilt the lower ward walls, added new towers, and fortified the main gateway. He spent lavishly on the royal apartments, installing glazed windows, painted chambers, and tiled floors. He added a great hall, a new kitchen, gardens planted with herbs and fruit trees. He turned Windsor from a garrison into a residence, a place where a king could hold court, receive ambassadors, and live in something approaching comfort. But the most significant additions were the ones visitors were never meant to see. Sally ports. These were small, concealed doors built into the base of the walls, hidden behind buttresses or sunk into the moat line. They allowed defenders to slip out of the castle unseen during a siege, to launch surprise attacks, or to escape if the walls were breached. They were military features, but they established something important about Windsor's character. The castle had doors that only some people knew about. Then there were the tunnels. Beneath the castle, passages ran in directions that even now are not fully mapped. A tunnel beneath Thames Street connected the castle to the town. Others led to positions outside the walls where supplies could be brought in or messengers sent out without being observed. These underground routes were practical. Every major medieval fortress had them. But at Windsor, they became part of the building's identity, a castle with secrets beneath its floors. A castle that moved in ways you could not see from the surface. In 1824, workmen digging near the castle discovered a shaft 20 feet deep, sealed and forgotten for centuries. No one knew who had built it or what it had been used for. It was simply there, a hole in the earth that the castle had swallowed and kept. This is the pattern that would define Windsor for the next 700 years. On the surface, grandeur. Below, concealment. The walls grew thicker with each generation. The passages multiplied. The building became a machine with two functions, to display power and to hide whatever might threaten the display. By the end of Henry III's reign, Windsor Castle covered more than 13 acres. Its walls enclosed two distinct wards, an enormous round keep, a chapel, royal apartments, service buildings, gardens, and a small town's worth of staff quarters. It was the largest royal residence in England, and it was riddled with hidden infrastructure, doors that did not appear on plans, passages that connected rooms no one spoke about, spaces designed from the first stone to be invisible. The castle had learned its trade. It could hold a court and hold a secret with equal ease. It could welcome a visiting dignitary through the main gate while moving something else entirely through a door he would never find. What it had not yet learned was how to lie about itself. That lesson required a king with a grander imagination and a looser relationship with the truth. A king who was born inside these walls and decided that the real Windsor was not good enough. He would build a fantasy instead. Chapter 3. A king builds his fantasy in Gothic stone. Edward III was born inside Windsor Castle, and he spent the rest of his life turning it into something it never was. He arrived in 1312, the son of the disastrously weak Edward II. By the time he seized power from his mother's regency in 1330, he had a clear vision of what kingship should look like. And Windsor was where that vision would take physical form. Edward did not merely renovate the castle, he reinvented it. He tore down Henry III's royal apartments and built new ones on a scale that stunned even his own court. The upper ward was transformed into a Gothic palace, its walls pierced with enormous windows, its halls hung with tapestries, its chambers heated by fireplaces large enough to stand in. He spent over £50,000 on the work, a sum that would be hundreds of millions today. But the most enduring act of reinvention was not architectural, it was theatrical. In 1348, Edward founded the Order of the Garter. It was a chivalric brotherhood, limited to the king and 25 knights, modeled on the Arthurian legends that Edward adored. Its spiritual home was St. George's Chapel at Windsor. Its ceremonies were elaborate performances of medieval virtue, processions, feasts, tournaments, the whole vocabulary of knighthood staged within the castle walls. The order was, in a sense, a fiction. By 1348, the age of mounted knights deciding the outcome of battles was already fading. The longbow had changed warfare forever at Crécy 2 years earlier, and Edward knew it. He had commanded the archers himself, but the Order of the Garter insisted that chivalry was alive, that the old code still held, that Windsor Castle was its living temple. St. George's Chapel became the stage for this performance. The building Edward began would be rebuilt spectacularly under Edward IV and Henry VII in the late 1400s, becoming the masterpiece of perpendicular Gothic architecture that stands today. Its fan-vaulted ceiling, its carved choir stalls, its stained glass, all of it designed to make anyone who entered feel that they had stepped into a world older and nobler than the one outside. It worked. The Order of the Garter endures to this day. The chapel still hosts its annual ceremony. And the fiction Edward created, that Windsor is the seat of an unbroken chivalric tradition, became so deeply embedded in the castle's identity that it can no longer be separated from the stone itself. But the most dramatic transformation was still centuries away. When George IV inherited the throne in 1820, Windsor Castle was, by the standards of a European palace, an embarrassment. It was a jumble of medieval fragments, Tudor additions, and Baroque repairs. It had no coherent style. It had no grand approach. Compared to Versailles or the Winter Palace, it looked like what it was, 1,000 years of improvisation. George was determined to fix this. He hired the architect Geoffrey Wyatville, and what followed was one of the most audacious acts of architectural fraud in British history. Wyatville did not restore Windsor Castle. He invented it. He raised the round tower by 33 feet, in adding a hollow stone crown that made the medieval keep look twice as imposing. The original Norman structure vanished inside a Gothic shell. He doubled the length of St. George's Hall to 180 feet, creating a banqueting space that could seat 150 guests. He roofed over an entire courtyard to create the Waterloo Chamber, a room celebrating the defeat of Napoleon that never existed before 1820. He built the Grand Corridor, 550 feet of gallery, running along the eastern and southern ranges of the Upper Ward, lined with paintings, porcelain, and suits of armor. He added Gothic battlements to every surface, crenellations and turrets and arrow slits that had no military function whatsoever. They were scenery, stage dressing for a building that was performing the role of a medieval fortress while actually being a regency palace. The budget was catastrophic. Parliament had authorized £300,000. Wyatville spent more than £1 million. Parliament voted £527,000 in official grants. Wyatville requested another $128,000. The cost overrun was roughly sevenfold, but no one stopped him. The king wanted his castle, and the castle wanted to be wanted. By the time Wyatville finished, Windsor looked exactly like what it had never been. An ancient, unified, Gothic masterpiece. A castle that appeared to have stood unchanged since the days of chivalry. Every stone screamed permanence. Every battlement whispered tradition. And almost none of it was real. Act 1 ends here. The castle stands at its aesthetic peak, a magnificent fiction of medieval permanence built almost entirely in the 19th century. A building that has learned not just to hide things, but to lie about what it is. And the first great test of that lie was already unfolding. Because while Wyatville was raising towers and adding battlements, somewhere inside those walls, in rooms the builders were careful to work around, a king was losing his mind. And the castle was doing what it did best. It was keeping quiet. Chapter 4. The King Who Screamed Behind Closed Doors. Somewhere inside Windsor Castle, a king was tied to a chair and told it was for his own good. George III had been ill before. The first episode came in 1788, A sudden descent into confusion and agitation that terrified his court and delighted his political enemies. He recovered. It happened again in 1801. He recovered again. The pattern seemed manageable. The king was sometimes unwell. He always got better. The machine of monarchy rolled on. But in 1810, the machine broke. The trigger was grief. In November of that year, Princess Amelia, George's youngest and most beloved daughter, died of tuberculosis. She was 27 years old. George had visited her constantly during her final illness, watching her fade, listening to her cough, unable to do anything that his title or his treasury could provide. When she died, something in him snapped. Within weeks, he was exhibiting the symptoms that his physicians had learned to dread. Rapid, even pressured speech that went on for hours without pause, wild agitation, hallucinations, conversations with people who were not in the room, conversations with people who were not alive. This time, he did not recover. For the next 10 years, from 1810 to his death in January 1820, George III lived inside Windsor Castle as a prisoner of his own body and his own household. He was confined to a set of rooms in the North Terrace, overlooking the garden he could no longer walk in. He was not permitted to leave. He was not permitted to receive visitors without supervision. He was, for all practical purposes, sealed inside the building. The rooms became a world in miniature. George paced when he was able. He sat when he was restrained. He played the harpsichord with increasing difficulty, in his fingers struggling to find keys they had once commanded with ease. He talked endlessly. He addressed ministers who had been dead for 20 years. He gave orders to servants about events that had happened in another century. He spoke to Amelia. He told her about his day. Outside those rooms, the country carried on. The regency had been established. The Prince of Wales governed as Prince Regent. Napoleon was defeated. Waterloo was won. The Congress of Vienna redrew the map of Europe. The greatest decade of British military triumph unfolded while the king who nominally presided over it sat in a chair, unable to recognize his own sons. The treatments were medieval in their cruelty. His physicians, led by the formidable Dr. Robert Willis, used a restraint chair. It was a heavy wooden seat with leather straps that bound the king's arms, legs, and torso. George called it his throne. Whether this was delusion or dark humor, no one recorded. The chair held him immobile for hours at a time, sometimes days. When he struggled, the straps were tightened. Straight waistcoats were applied when the chair was not enough. These were canvas jackets that pinned his arms to his sides, the same garments used in the asylums that George himself had never seen and would never visit. A king in a straitjacket. The image is almost too grotesque to credit, but the medical records are clear. The physicians also employed blistering agents. Poultices made with cantharides, commonly known as Spanish fly, were applied to the king's scalp, arms, and legs. The chemical raised painful blisters on the skin. The theory was that the blisters would draw the illness out of the body. The reality was that a 70-year-old man, already confused and frightened, was subjected to burns that left him screaming. And he did scream. The accounts from attendants describe episodes of shouting, wailing, and incoherent speech that lasted for hours. At Christmas in 1819, less than a month before his death, George spoke continuously for 58 hours. 58 hours. More than 2 full days of unbroken speech, an unending stream of words addressed to courtiers who had died decades earlier, to his daughter Amelia, to Lord North, to figures from a reign that had ended 9 years before. Windsor Castle absorbed all of it. The 7-meter walls that Henry III had built did their work. The screams did not reach the courtyards. The weeping did not penetrate the state apartments. The king's madness existed in a pocket of silence at the heart of the largest castle in England, and the building held that silence like a fist. Meanwhile, the monarchy managed the narrative. Official health bulletins were issued to the press, carefully worded to suggest that the king was indisposed but comfortable. The word comfortable appeared again and again. The bulletins never mentioned the restraint chair. They never mentioned the blistering. They never mentioned the 58 hours of continuous speech. They mentioned that His Majesty had passed a quiet night, or that His Majesty's condition remained unchanged. The Prince of Wales, the future George IV, played his own game. He wanted the regency. He wanted power. And he wanted medical opinions that supported his claim that his father was permanently incapacitated. He planted his own physician, Dr. Henry Halford, to write reports emphasizing the king's decline. The medical records from this period are a battlefield of competing interests, each doctor writing not what he observed, but what his patron needed him to observe. George III died on the 29th of January, 1820. He was 81 years old. He had been blind for the last 6 years, deaf for much of that time, confined to Windsor Castle for a full decade. He was buried in St. George's Chapel, beneath the floor of the building that had held him captive. The official narrative was seamless. A beloved king, tragically afflicted, cared for with devotion in his ancestral home. The reality was something else. A man strapped to a chair in a room no one was allowed to enter, in a castle whose walls were thick enough to swallow his suffering whole. Windsor had passed its first great test. It had taken a king's madness, sealed it behind stone, and delivered to the public a fiction of dignified decline. The building had learned that its most important function was not to house royalty. It was to hide the moments when royalty became something the public could not be allowed to see. But madness was a private crisis, a thing that could be managed behind closed doors. The castle's next test would come from the outside, from the sky, from a war that would threaten to expose something the royal family had hidden, not in a room, but in their own blood, their name. Chapter 5. The Night. A dynasty erased its own name. On the 17th of July 1917, the British royal family woke up German and went to bed English. It sounds like a joke. Kaiser Wilhelm II treated it as one. When news of the name change reached him at German military headquarters, he reportedly quipped that he was looking forward to attending a performance of the Merry Wives of Saxe-Coburg-Gotha. It is a good line. It is also the laughter of a man who did not understand what was really happening. What was happening was survival. George V had occupied the British throne since 1910. He was, by every measure of breeding, a German monarch. His grandfather was Prince Albert of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha. His grandmother was Queen Victoria, herself descended from the House of Hanover. His first cousins included the Kaiser and the Tsar. The royal houses of Europe were a single, extended family, intermarried so thoroughly that the Great War was, at one level, a family argument conducted with artillery. And the argument was killing millions. By 1917, Britain had lost over 700,000 men. The Somme had consumed a generation. The spring offensive had stalled. Rationing was tightening. The public mood was turning dark, searching for explanations, for targets, for someone to blame. For the first 3 years of the war, the family name had not been a problem. The public was focused on the trenches, on the casualty lists, on the U-boat blockade that was starving the country. The royal family's German ancestry was a known fact, but it sat in the background, an awkwardness rather than a crisis. Then 2 things happened in quick succession. In March 1917, the Russian Revolution toppled Tsar Nicholas II, George's first cousin. The king who looked most like George, who shared his grandmother, who had stood beside him at family gatherings, was now a prisoner of his own people. The message was impossible to miss. Royal families with inconvenient foreign connections could be destroyed. Then the Gotha bombers came. In June 1917, a squadron of German heavy bombers appeared over London in broad daylight. They were Gotha G4 aircraft, twin-engine biplanes with an 80-foot wingspan, named after the German city where they were manufactured. Gotha, the same word that appeared in the king's official surname. The bombers killed 162 people in a single raid, including 18 children at a school in Poplar. It was the deadliest air attack on London until the Blitz. The public reaction was volcanic. Anti-German riots erupted across the country. Shops with German-sounding names had their windows smashed. Dachshunds were kicked in the streets. German-born residents who had lived in Britain for decades were interned. And somewhere in the noise, someone pointed out the obvious. The king's family name was the same as the bombers dropping explosives on London schoolchildren. George V was furious, not at the public, at the situation. He understood, with a political instinct that his more intellectually gifted relatives lacked, that the name had become impossible. It did not matter that Saxe-Coburg-Gotha was a historical designation with no connection to German military policy. It did not matter that George himself despised the Kaiser and had supported the war effort from the first day. What mattered was the word, the syllables, the German sounds coming out of English mouths at a moment when German sounds meant death. His private secretary, Lord Stamfordham, was tasked with finding a replacement. Stamfordham considered several options: Tudor, Plantagenet, York, Lancaster, Fitzroy, England. Each was rejected for one reason or another: too historical, too partisan, too loaded with associations. Then Stamfordham suggested Windsor. It was perfect. The castle was the most visible symbol of English monarchy. It had no German connotations. It sounded ancient, solid, and thoroughly English. The fact that the castle itself was built by a French-speaking Norman and renovated by a German-loving Hanoverian was beside the point. Windsor sounded right. And in a crisis, sounding right is everything. On the 17th of July, 1917, the king issued a Royal Proclamation. The House of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha was dissolved. In its place stood the House of Windsor. Every member of the royal family who bore German titles was expected to renounce them. New English titles were created to replace the old German ones. The Battenbergs became the Mountbattens. Prince Louis of Battenberg, who had already been forced to resign as First Sea Lord because of his German birth, became the Marquis of Milford Haven. His son, who would later become Lord Mountbatten of Burma, carried the anglicized name for the rest of his life. In St. George's Chapel at Windsor, the heraldic banners of German relatives were quietly removed from the walls. The garter stalls of enemy royals were stripped of their insignia. Men who had been honored as brothers of the order were erased from its records, their names and arms taken down as though they had never been members. 3 German relatives of the king lost their British peerages entirely. The Duke of Cumberland, the Duke of Albany, and Prince Ernst August of Hanover were removed from the British aristocracy by Act of Parliament. Centuries of family connections severed in a single legislative session. The scale of the erasure was breathtaking. An entire dynasty renamed itself, stripped its own chapel, revoked its cousins' titles, and buried its ancestry under a single English word. And the word they chose was not a person, not a place of birth, not a family seat. It was a building. They named themselves after their castle. Think about what that means. When the monarchy needed an identity that would survive the destruction of its real one, it reached for the only thing solid enough to bear the weight. Not a bloodline, not a tradition, not a god, a building, a castle on a chalk hill above the Thames. Windsor Castle did not merely witness the reinvention, it was the reinvention. Its name became the dynasty's name. Its permanence became theirs. Its fiction of ancient, unchanging Englishness was transferred wholesale onto a family that had been German for 2 centuries. The castle had performed its greatest trick. It had given its own identity to the people who lived inside it, and in doing so, it had ensured that as long as the castle stood, the name would survive. The building and the family were now the same thing. An attack on one was an attack on both. But a name change only works if no one looks too closely at what was erased. And within 20 years, the castle would face a crisis that no name could fix. A king would sit before a microphone inside these walls and speak words that would break the monarchy's most basic rule. He would tell the truth. Chapter 6. The Voice That Emptied the Throne. On the evening of the 11th of December, 1936, a man sat before a microphone inside Windsor Castle and talked himself out of a kingdom. The room was the Augusta Tower. It was small, cluttered, and cold. A BBC engineer had set up equipment on a table. 2 chairs, a microphone, a glass of water. Outside, it was already dark. Inside, Edward VIII, for a few more hours, still technically a member of the royal family, prepared to do something no British monarch had ever done. He was going to explain himself. The crisis had been building for months. Edward had become king in January 1936 upon the death of his father, George V. From the beginning, his reign was shadowed by a single problem: Wallis Simpson. She was American. She was a commoner. She had been divorced once and was in the process of divorcing her second husband. Under the constitutional conventions of the time, the king, as supreme governor of the Church of England, could not marry a divorced woman whose former husband was still alive. Edward did not care. He loved her. He said so to anyone who would listen, and many who preferred not to. He told Prime Minister Stanley Baldwin that he intended to marry her. Baldwin told him it was constitutionally impossible. The Dominion Prime Ministers, consulted through the Imperial Conference, unanimously agreed. Australia, Canada, South Africa, the Irish Free State. Not one government was willing to accept Wallis Simpson as queen. Edward proposed a morganatic marriage in which Wallis would be his wife but not his queen. Baldwin rejected it. The cabinet rejected it. The dominions rejected it. The church rejected it. The only people who supported it were a handful of Edward's personal friends and, briefly and disastrously, Winston Churchill, whose speech in the House of Commons defending the king was shouted down so violently that he did not finish it. Edward was left with 3 choices: give up Wallis, give up the throne, or provoke a constitutional crisis that could destroy the monarchy entirely. He chose the second option. On the 10th of December 1936, Edward signed the instrument of abdication, 6 identical copies, each witnessed by his 3 brothers. The document was short, the language was formal, the effect was seismic. A king had voluntarily relinquished the crown for the first time in British history. His reign had lasted 327 days, but the abdication itself was a legal formality. The performance came the next evening. Edward traveled to Windsor Castle. The BBC had been notified. The broadcast would go out live on radio to the nation and the empire. Hundreds of millions of people would hear it. And the script had been polished with characteristic flair by Winston Churchill himself. The Augusta Tower room was not grand. It was not designed for this purpose. A small, square space, furnished hastily with borrowed equipment. The microphone sat on a plain table. The cables ran through corridors to a transmitter van parked in the castle yard. This was the most consequential broadcast in British history, and it was being staged in a room that felt like an afterthought. But perhaps that was fitting. The castle was already distancing itself from the man inside it. The introduction was the first wound. Sir John Wraith, the Director General of the BBC, had been instructed by the new king, George VI, on precisely how to present the speaker. Edward was no longer king. He was no longer His Majesty. Wraith introduced him as His Royal Highness Prince Edward. The demotion was delivered live, in real time, to a global audience. The monarchy was stripping its own member of his rank, while the microphone was still warm. Edward spoke for less than 10 minutes. His voice was steady. His words were careful. He told the nation that he had found it impossible to carry the heavy burden of responsibility and to discharge his duties as king, as he would wish to do without the help and support of the woman he loved. It is among the most famous sentences in the English language. It is also a masterpiece of euphemism. He did not say that he had been told to choose between love and duty by a government that gave him no room to negotiate. He did not say that the woman he loved had been deemed unacceptable by an establishment that would happily tolerate royal mistresses, but could not stomach a divorced American as queen. He finished the broadcast. He left Windsor Castle that night by car. He crossed the English Channel and began an exile that would last, with brief interruptions, for the rest of his life. The monarchy's response was swift and precise. Edward was given the title Duke of Windsor. Think about that. The castle that had just witnessed his most humiliating moment, the room where he had surrendered his birthright before the world, gave its name to his consolation prize. He would carry the word Windsor for the rest of his days, not as a king, as a reminder, and Wallace was punished too. When Edward married her in June 1937, the palace announced that she would not receive the title Her Royal Highness. The wife of a Royal Highness was entitled to the style by established convention. The convention was overridden by royal decree. The message was unmistakable. You may marry him, but you will never be one of us. Edward lived another 35 years. He died in Paris in May 1972. His body was brought back to England and buried at Frogmore, the royal burial ground within the Windsor estate. He lies within the castle's walls. But Frogmore is not St. George's Chapel. It is the quiet corner, the back garden, the place where the family buries the members it does not wish to discuss at dinner. Close, but never close enough. That was Edward's sentence. Named for the castle, buried in its grounds. but kept at arm's length, even in death, from the heart of the institution he had tried to reshape in his own image. Act 2 ends here. The monarchy has survived 3 crises. A king's madness, sealed behind stone. A dynasty's name, replaced with the castle's own. A king's love, weaponized into exile and burial at the margins. In each case, the castle was the instrument. Its walls contained the screaming. Its name absorbed the rebranding. Its rooms staged the farewell. Windsor Castle did not merely witness these moments, it managed them. But the castle's greatest test was still to come, not from madness or war or love, from something far simpler and far more destructive. Fire. Chapter 7. 115 rooms turned to ash. At 11:30 on the morning of the 20th of November, 1992, a curtain touched a spotlight in the private chapel, and Windsor Castle began to burn. The spotlight had been left on. A restorer had placed it close to the heavy fabric that hung beside the altar, part of a routine maintenance project on the chapel's interior. The heat built slowly, then ignited. Within minutes, the private chapel was ablaze. Within an hour, the fire had spread into the ceiling void above, a labyrinth of ancient timber beams and air spaces that carried the flames horizontally through the upper ward, like a fuse burning through the castle's nervous system. The alarm was raised. The castle's own fire brigade responded first, but they were not equipped for a blaze of this scale. The Berkshire Fire and Rescue Service arrived next, followed by crews from 7 surrounding counties. By mid-afternoon, 225 firefighters were on site. 36 fire pumps were working simultaneously. Hoses were run through corridors, up staircases, across courtyards. The castle's ancient plumbing could not supply enough water. Pumps were set up on the Thames itself, drawing river water and pushing it uphill to the castle walls. The heat was extraordinary. Firefighters entering the upper ward described walls that glowed. Lead from the roof melted and ran in streams down the stonework. The air inside the burning rooms was hot enough to ignite clothing at a distance. Crews worked in relays, 10 minutes inside, 10 minutes recovering in the courtyard, breath by breath, room by room, trying to contain a fire that seemed to have a will of its own. The fire burned for 15 hours. It consumed 115 rooms. 9 principal state rooms were gutted entirely. St. George's Hall, the great banqueting chamber that Geoffrey Wyatville had stretched to 180 feet, collapsed. Its hammer beam roof, its carved paneling, its chandeliers and candelabra, all of it fell into a heap of burning timber and molten metal. The ceiling of the grand reception room, a masterpiece of gilded plasterwork, peeled away from its structure and crashed to the floor in fragments. In the state dining room, a 16-foot equestrian portrait of George III hung on the wall. It was too large to remove through any door. Firefighters and conservators stood in front of it, debating options while smoke poured through the ceiling above. They could not save it in one piece. They could not cut it free. The painting was lost, but much else was saved, and the story of what was saved is as remarkable as the story of what burned. Prince Andrew, the Queen's second son, was at the castle when the fire started. He immediately organized a human chain of castle staff, soldiers from the garrison, and anyone else who could be pressed into service. Paintings were pulled from walls. Furniture was carried down smoke-filled corridors. Silver, porcelain, manuscripts, and miniatures were loaded onto whatever was available: trolleys, blankets, outstretched arms. The Royal Library staff rescued manuscripts that had survived since the 15th century, carrying them through the smoke in their bare hands. The Queen arrived in the afternoon. She stood in the quadrangle, a small figure in a dark coat, watching her home burn. The cameras found her there. The image became iconic, a monarch watching the physical embodiment of her family's identity consumed by fire. She said little. There was little to say. By the time the fire was brought under control, just before 2 a.m. on the 21st, the castle staff had salvaged an extraordinary portion of the royal collection. Many of the most valuable items had been in storage, or in parts of the castle the fire did not reach. The losses, while significant, were not catastrophic in terms of the collection's total value. The building itself had taken the worst of it. 1.5 million gallons of water had been pumped into the upper ward. The structural damage covered 9,000 square meters, roughly 1/5 of the castle's total floor area. The roof was gone over vast sections. Walls that had stood since George IV's renovation were blackened, cracked, and in some cases dangerously unstable. The date itself felt like a cruel footnote. The 20th of November, 1992 was Queen Elizabeth II's 45th wedding anniversary. There were no celebrations, and the fire fell at the end of a year that had already earned a name the Queen would use in a speech 4 days later: Annus Horribilis, her horrible year. In March, Prince Andrew and Sarah Ferguson had separated. In April, Princess Anne had divorced Captain Mark Phillips. In June, Andrew Morton's biography of Diana had been published, revealing details of bulimia, self-harm, and marital misery that shattered the image of the royal marriage. In August, transcripts of an intimate phone call between Diana and James Gilby had been published by the tabloids. In November, transcripts of a call between Charles and Camilla Parker Bowles would follow. The fire at Windsor was not, in itself, in the worst of these events, but it was the most visible. A castle burning on live television, flames pouring from the roof of the building that bore the royal family's name. The symbolism was not subtle. The House of Windsor was on fire, and the whole country could see it. The castle had survived madness. It had survived a name change. It had survived an abdication, but it had never been physically wounded like this. 115 rooms, 9 state rooms, 15 hours. And when the smoke cleared, the most dangerous question was not how to rebuild. It was who would pay. Chapter 8. The public refused to pay. When the government suggested that taxpayers should repair the Queen's castle, 90% of the country said no. The Heritage Secretary, Peter Brooke, made the announcement on the day of the fire. He stood before the cameras with smoke still rising behind him and declared that the government would fund the restoration. Windsor Castle was, after all, Crown property. It belonged to the nation. The government was insured. The taxpayer would cover the cost. He expected sympathy. He got a firestorm. The reaction was immediate and overwhelming. London Broadcasting ran a phone in the following day. 1,600 callers rang in. 90% of them opposed public funding for the repair. The calls were not polite, they were furious. Caller after caller demanded to know why ordinary people should pay to fix a castle owned by one of the richest women in the world. The newspapers were worse. Tabloid and broadsheet alike turned on the proposal with a ferocity that surprised even seasoned observers. Editorial writers pointed out that the Queen paid no income tax, that the royal collection, valued at hundreds of millions of pounds, was exempt from inheritance tax, that the civil list, the annual public payment to the monarchy, had been set at £7,150,000. £900,000 per year, and was not subject to parliamentary debate. In the House of Commons, Dennis Skinner, the Labour MP for Bolsover, stood up and said what millions were thinking. He demanded that the Queen pay for the repairs herself. Skinner was known for his blunt rhetoric, but this time he was not performing. He was channeling a public mood that had shifted in ways the palace had not anticipated. Another MP made a point that was harder to dismiss with partisan politics. He observed that 400 yards from Buckingham Palace, people were sleeping in cardboard boxes. The contrast was devastating. A government that could not house its citizens was proposing to spend tens of millions restoring the private residence of a woman who owned multiple palaces. The arguments in favor of public funding were reasonable. Windsor Castle was a national heritage site. It was owned by the Crown, not by the Queen personally. The government had a responsibility to maintain it. These points were legally sound and historically precedented. None of them mattered. What mattered was the feeling. The sense that the contract between the monarchy and the people had been broken. The deal, never written down but universally understood, was simple. The public pays for the pageantry, and the monarchy provides something in return: stability, continuity, a sense of national identity embodied in a family that lives above ordinary concerns. But in 1992, the family was not living above ordinary concerns. It was drowning in them. Divorces, infidelities, leaked phone calls, tabloid revelations. The royal family had become a soap opera, and the public was being asked to fund the set repairs. The fire had exposed something the castle was not built to conceal. Not a king's madness, not a German name, not an abdication. Something more fundamental: the growing gap between the monarchy's cost and its perceived value. The question was no longer whether the castle could be restored. It was whether the institution it represented was worth restoring. The timing was lethal. Britain was in recession. Unemployment stood at nearly 3 million. The National Health Service was under strain. Schools were underfunded. Homelessness had become a visible scandal in every major city. Into this landscape of austerity dropped the suggestion that the public should fund the renovation of a palace. The political tone deafness was almost impressive in its completeness. Polls conducted in the weeks after the fire showed a sharp decline in support for the monarchy, not a collapse. The British public's relationship with the Crown is more complicated than simple approval or disapproval. But the numbers moved, and they moved in a direction that the palace had not seen in decades. For the first time in living memory, a significant portion of the public was openly questioning whether the monarchy justified its cost. The fire had cracked the castle's walls. The funding debate cracked something deeper: the assumption of deference. The idea that the monarchy existed beyond the reach of public criticism. The belief that because the castle was old, the institution inside it was beyond question. Windsor Castle had survived every previous crisis by concealing, rebranding, or exiling the problem. But you cannot conceal a building that is burning on live television. You cannot rebrand a repair bill, and you cannot exile the public. The Queen needed a new strategy, and for the first time in her reign, she found one. She opened the doors. Chapter 9. The Queen opens her doors and her books. Elizabeth II did something no British monarch had done in 60 years. She admitted that the Crown owed the public an accounting. The announcement came in stages, and each one a concession that would have been unthinkable a year earlier. Together, They amounted to the most significant reshaping of the monarchy's financial relationship with the public since the civil list was established in 1760. First, the tax. In February 1993, the palace announced that the Queen would voluntarily pay income tax on her personal income. This had not been required since the 1930s, when George VI had struck an informal agreement with the Treasury exempting the sovereign from taxation. Elizabeth had inherited the exemption and maintained it for 40 years. Now she surrendered it. The significance was enormous, not because the amount was large. The Queen's personal income, as distinct from the Crown estate revenues and the civil list, was a private matter, and the exact figures were not disclosed, but the principle mattered. A monarch paying tax is a monarch acknowledging that she is, at some level, a citizen, subject to the same obligations as everyone else. It was a crack in the wall between the Crown and the people, and the Queen made it deliberately. Second, the doors. In August 1993, Buckingham Palace opened to the public for the first time. Visitors could tour the state rooms during the summer months when the Queen was in residence at Balmoral. The admission price was £8. In the first 8 weeks, the palace received over 300,000 visitors and raised more than £2 million. The money was earmarked for Windsor's restoration. But the symbolism outweighed the revenue. The most private residence of the most private monarch in the world was now a tourist attraction. Anyone with £8 could walk through the throne room, the picture gallery, the grand staircase. The palace that had been built to separate the sovereign from the public was now charging the public to come inside. Third, the personal contribution. The Queen committed £2 million from her own funds to the restoration of Windsor Castle. The Duchy of Lancaster and the Royal Collection Trust contributed additional amounts. The total restoration budget was set at £36.5 million. The project was overseen by the Duke of Edinburgh's committee, which made a series of decisions that revealed a sophisticated understanding of what the restoration needed to achieve. The committee brought in the architect Giles Downes of the Siddell-Gibson Partnership, whose approach balanced historical fidelity with honest contemporary craft. Some rooms were restored to their exact pre-fire appearance. The Wyatville interiors, the gilded plasterwork, the carved paneling. All of it was recreated using traditional materials and techniques by craftsmen who in some cases had to relearn skills that had not been practiced for a century. Over 1,500 workers were employed at the peak of construction. They used over 2,000 tons of English oak. But other rooms were redesigned entirely. The new St. George's Hall was given a green oak hammerbeam roof that did not attempt to replicate Wyatville's original. Instead, it was a contemporary interpretation of Gothic architecture, using engineering techniques unavailable in the 1820s. The roof's 600 oak trees came from forests across Britain, each one selected by hand. The carved shields of the Garter Knights were reinstalled along the walls, but the ceiling above them was something new, lighter, higher, more luminous than what had burned. The private chapel, where the fire had started, was transformed into the lantern lobby, an octagonal entrance hall with a vaulted ceiling that let light pour down from above. The room that had been destroyed became something new, not a restoration, a reinvention. The restoration was completed on the 20th of November, 1997, 5 years to the day after the fire. The date was also the Queen's 50th wedding anniversary. This time, the symmetry felt earned. The project came in within budget, £36.5 million, against the original estimate of £36.5 million. In an era when government construction projects routinely exceeded their budgets by 50 or 100%, the Windsor restoration became a case study in project management. Every pound was accounted for. Every decision was documented. The restoration that could have been the monarchy's greatest embarrassment became, instead, a quiet demonstration of competence. And here's the paradox that sits at the heart of this story. The fire should have been a disaster. It was a disaster. 115 rooms destroyed. A beloved national landmark gutted. The Queen's own home burning on her wedding anniversary. But the crisis forced changes that strengthened the monarchy more than decades of stability ever had. The tax concession diffused the most potent argument against royal privilege. The opening of Buckingham Palace generated revenue and goodwill simultaneously. The restoration demonstrated that the institution could manage public money responsibly. And the rebuilt rooms at Windsor, mixing faithful restoration with bold redesign, embodied the principle that had sustained the castle for 9 centuries. Permanence is not about staying the same. It is about surviving the change. The machine worked again. Windsor Castle absorbed the fire, absorbed the anger, absorbed the demand for accountability, and emerged not merely repaired, but renovated. The building had done what it always does. It had taken a crisis that threatened to destroy it and used the destruction as raw material for reinvention. But beneath the restored floors and behind the rebuilt walls, the castle still holds its older secrets. The rooms where a king screamed, the chapel where German banners were torn down, the tower where a man surrendered his crown, and below all of it, in the earth itself, the dead. Chapter 10. The Dead Kings Beneath the Chapel Floor. 11 monarchs lie beneath the stones of St. George's Chapel, and every one of them has a secret buried alongside. Henry VIII is here, the great tyrant, the man who broke with Rome, dissolved the monasteries, and married 6 wives. He lies in a vault beneath the choir, alongside Jane Seymour, the 3rd wife who gave him the son he destroyed his kingdom to get. And Jane died 12 days after the birth. Henry waited 11 years before joining her. In the intervening decade, he married 3 more women, executed 2 of them, and reshaped the religious landscape of an entire continent. His coffin has never been formally opened. The monument he commissioned for himself, designed to be the grandest royal tomb in Europe, was never completed. The Italian marble he ordered was never carved. He lies in an unmarked vault, the most powerful king in English history, with no stone above him bearing his name. The castle absorbed even his vanity. Charles I is here too, the king who lost his head. After his execution in January 1649, on a scaffold outside the banqueting house in Whitehall, Parliament refused him a state funeral. His body was brought to Windsor in a snowstorm. The burial party arrived at St. George's Chapel with no ceremony, no procession, no bishop willing to read the service. The parliamentary troops guarding the chapel would not permit Anglican rites. They lowered the coffin into a vault beside Henry VIII and left. The snow fell on the chapel roof, and a contemporary account says it whitened the velvet pall draped over the coffin, as if heaven itself were mourning what Parliament would not acknowledge. England was a republic for the first time in its history, and the dead king lay inside the castle's most sacred space, put there not with honor, but with haste, as if the building itself was trying to swallow the evidence. George III is here, 10 years of screaming, 10 years of restraint, 10 years of carefully worded health bulletins, and then silence. He was buried in the royal vault beneath the chapel in February 1820, freed at last from the chair he called his throne. The funeral was grand. The eulogies were generous. No one mentioned the straitjackets. Edward VIII is not here. Not exactly. He lies at Frogmore, the burial ground within the Windsor estate, but outside the castle walls. A 15-minute walk from St. George's Chapel. Close enough to be considered part of the family. Far enough to be excluded from its heart. Wallis lies beside him. She died in 1986, 50 years after the abdication, and was buried next to the man who gave up a crown for her. Even in death, they are kept at the edge of things. Elizabeth II is here. She was interred in the King George VI Memorial Chapel, a small side chapel added to St. George's in 1969. Prince Philip lies beside her, as do the ashes of Princess Margaret. The family is together. The chapel holds them all. 11 monarchs, centuries of power, ambition, cruelty, love, madness, and reinvention. All of it compressed into stone boxes beneath a floor that millions of tourists walk across every year, most of them unaware that they are standing on the compressed weight of English history. The chapel is not just a burial ground. It is a filing cabinet. Each body represents a story that the castle has absorbed and sealed away. The madness, the executions, the exiles, the quiet deaths of old age. All of it stored in the same building, beneath the same roof, behind the same walls that have been filtering the truth for 950 years. The dead do not speak, but the building speaks for them. And what it says, as it has always said, is that everything is fine, that the monarchy endures, that the castle stands. Above the vaults, the living carry on. Chapter 11. The castle that watches its own performance. Every Tuesday, Thursday, and Saturday at 11 in the morning, Windsor Castle performs the same lie it has been telling for 950 years. The changing of the guard. Soldiers in scarlet tunics and bearskin caps march through the castle gates to the sound of a military band. Tourists line the route. Cameras click. Children point. The ceremony takes 30 minutes. It has no military function. It is pure theater, and it is performed with the precision of a West End production because the castle demands it. Yet Windsor Castle today is a machine with two outputs, ceremony and revenue. King Charles III holds investitures in the Waterloo Chamber, the room that Wyatteville roofed over 2 centuries ago to celebrate the defeat of Napoleon. State visits arrive by horse-drawn carriage along the Long Walk, a 2.5-mile avenue of elm trees that runs from the castle to the Great Park. Garter Day brings the Knights of the Order in procession through the castle grounds, their blue velvet robes trailing behind them, the same ritual Edward III inaugurated in 1348. Over 1 million visitors pass through the castle each year. They pay £31 each for admission. The Royal Collection Trust, which manages the public opening, uses the revenue to maintain the castle and its contents. The Sovereign Grant, which replaced the civil list in 2012, provides £86.3 million per year across all royal residences. Windsor receives its share. 150 staff live within the castle walls. Some of their roles have existed for centuries. The fendersmith tends 300 fireplaces, polishing brass fenders and maintaining grates in rooms that are now heated by central heating, but still keep their fires lit because the castle insists on the appearance of tradition. The role has been passed from father to son across generations. a job description that predates the Industrial Revolution, performed daily in a building that has wireless internet. The kitchen clocks run 5 minutes fast. This is not an error. It is policy. The clocks were set ahead so that meals would never be late, so that the king or queen would never be kept waiting. No one remembers who gave the order. The clocks simply are fast, and no one has corrected them, because the castle does not acknowledge that anything about itself might be wrong. In the Blue Room, the private apartment once used by Queen Victoria, hot water was delivered every morning for 40 years after Prince Albert's death in 1861. Victoria ordered that Albert's rooms be maintained as though he were still alive. His clothes were laid out. His writing desk was kept supplied with fresh paper and ink. Hot water appeared each day for a shave he would never need. The ritual continued until Victoria's own death in 1901. 40 years of serving a ghost, because the castle's deepest instinct is to preserve the illusion that nothing has changed, even when everything has. This is Windsor Castle now, a building that performs continuity while continuously reinventing itself. The guards march as they have always marched, except that their uniforms have been redesigned 7 times. The chapel holds its services as it has always held them, except that the congregation now includes tourists who have paid for the privilege. The staterooms gleam as they have always gleamed, except that a 5th of them were rebuilt from scratch after 1992. The castle does not distinguish between the real and the performed. It never has. From the day William the Conqueror piled chalk on a hilltop and called it a fortress, the building has existed in the space between what it is and what it appears to be. And that space, that gap between reality and performance, is not a weakness. It is the source of the castle's power, and it is time to say what that power really is. Chapter 12. The Lie That Outlasted Every Truth. Architect Sir William Whitfield once said, "Windsor Castle has a certain fictive quality, as if a theatrical performance is being put on here." He was being generous. Windsor Castle is not like a performance. It is a performance. It has been a performance since the day a Norman warlord heaped up chalk and told a conquered nation it was looking at a fortress. And the performance has never stopped. It has only changed costumes. Look at the building honestly. The Gothic battlements that crown every wall are 19th century fantasy, added by Geoffrey Wyatville to make a Regency palace look medieval. They have never defended anyone from anything. The Round Tower. The most recognized feature of the castle's silhouette is a hollow shell placed on top of a genuine Norman keep to make it look twice as tall. The crenellations are scenery. The arrow slits are decoration. The entire exterior of the upper ward is a lie told in stone. Look deeper. The Rococo interiors that dazzle visitors in the state rooms are plasterwork imitations of French originals, designed to give the impression of continental sophistication in a castle built on English chalk. The grand corridor's 550 feet of gallery were carved out of what had been a jumble of service passages. The Waterloo Chamber sits where a courtyard used to be. Rooms that appear ancient were built in the age of steam. Look at the name. The House of Windsor is not a historic dynasty. It is a branding exercise from 1917, adopted in panic when German bombers gave the royal family's real surname a meaning that could no longer be tolerated. The name that sounds so thoroughly English, so rooted, so permanent, is younger than jazz. This is the castle's secret. Not any single act of concealment, but the totality of the fiction. layer upon layer of renovation, rebranding, and narrative control, until the building itself has become indistinguishable from the performance it stages. Windsor Castle is a palimpsest, a manuscript written over and over, each new text concealing the one beneath. George III's madness became a managed absence, a decade of screaming, reduced in the official record to health bulletins that mention comfort and quiet nights. The restraint chair became a throne. The straitjacket became a medical precaution. The suffering was real. The narrative was fiction, and the castle held both. The German heritage became a patriotic rebrand. 2 centuries of Hanoverian and Saxe-Coburg blood dissolved in a single proclamation. The Garter banners came down, the titles were revoked, the cousins were erased, and in their place, a name so solid, so English, so inevitable that within a generation no one could remember the family had ever been called anything else. The abdication became proof of constitutional strength. A king chose love over duty, and the system survived. The monarchy did not fall. It simply replaced the faulty component and carried on. Edward was exiled, titled, and buried at a distance that allowed the family to claim him without endorsing him. The crisis that should have shattered the institution became the evidence that the institution could not be shattered. The fire became a catalyst for reform. 115 rooms destroyed, and the destruction forced more change in 5 years than stability had produced in 50. The Queen paid tax. The palaces opened. The accounts were published. The restoration was completed on time and on budget. The fire that should have been the final proof of decay became, instead, the mechanism of renewal. In every case, the pattern is the same. A crisis threatens to expose the gap between what Windsor appears to be and what it actually conceals. The castle absorbs the crisis. It renovates around the damage. It emerges not merely intact, but strengthened, the new layer of fiction so seamlessly applied that it becomes indistinguishable from the old ones beneath it. This is not an accident. It is a method refined over 950 years, tested by madness and war and fire and public fury, and found, each time, to work. Windsor Castle is not hiding the monarchy's lies. It is the lie, a continuously renovated fiction of permanence that has outlasted every truth that threatened to destroy it. The chalk mound is still there, buried inside stone. The Norman keep is still there, hidden inside the round tower. The screaming is still there, absorbed into the walls. The German name is still there, papered over with English syllables. The abdication is still there, filed away at Frogmore. The fire damage is still there, behind fresh plaster and new timber. Nothing is erased. Everything is contained. That is the castle's genius. It does not destroy its secrets. It builds over them. And with each new layer, the fiction grows thicker, stronger, more convincing, more permanent. Sir William Whitfield called it a theatrical performance. But no performance in history has run for 950 years without an intermission. No stage set has outlasted every empire that tried to tear it down. No script has been rewritten so many times that the rewrites themselves have become the tradition. The question the castle leaves us with is not whether the fiction is justified. It is whether permanence of any kind is possible without it. Whether any institution, any family, any nation can survive 9 centuries without learning to lie about itself. Whether the choice between truth and survival is really a choice at all, or simply the price that endurance demands. Windsor Castle stands on a chalk hill above the Thames. It has stood there since 1070. It will stand there tomorrow. Not because it is honest, not because it is real, because it is the most magnificent deception ever built in stone.